The wind came screaming off the high plains like it meant to skin a person alive. It pushed snow in ragged swirls down the single, frozen street of Blackthorn, Wyoming Territory, and rattled the warped shutters on the buildings that leaned against it. The snow wasn't white anymore. Not here. It was stained in places, brown from dirt churned up by wagon wheels, black where horses had stamped it to slush, and red in one ugly patch outside the saloon where two ranch hands had settled a dispute the night before. Clara Bennett tightened her grip on the rough hands of her younger siblings, Ruth and Samuel, and lowered her head against the cutting wind. Her bonnet did little to keep the cold from gnawing at her ears, and the worn shawl around her shoulders might as well have been paper for all the good it did. She was too aware of how small they looked, the children in their threadbare coats, their cheeks raw with windburn, eyes wide at the unfamiliar town. She had promised them warmth and food before sundown, but promises didn't put bread in a sack or fire in a hearth. The general store's windows glowed dimly against the storm, lamplight diffused by frost on the panes. She pushed the door open, and her heart sank at the dull jingle of the bell. Every head in the store turned, eyes crawling over her like they had the right. Most of the men leaned against the counter or the stove, hats tipped back, boots crusted with snow. They weren't cruel exactly, just curious in that way men on the frontier could be, curious enough to talk about you the minute you stepped outside. She guided Ruth and Samuel toward the back shelves, searching for flour and beans, though her mind counted and recounted the coins in her pocket. Too few. Always too few. When she set her meager selection on the counter, the storekeep, a squat man with whiskers the color of tobacco juice, ran his eyes over her and then over the children before announcing the price as though daring her to protest. "That's more'n I've got," she admitted quietly, heat prickling her neck. "Then you've not got enough," he said without looking up, and swept the items off the counter as if she'd dirted it. The quiet in the room thickened. Somewhere behind her, boots shifted against the floorboards. Clara reached for Ruth's hand again and turned toward the door, the familiar sour taste of failure rising in her mouth. That's when she noticed him. He was leaned back in the far corner near the stove, one boot hooked on the rung of his chair, hat pulled low over eyes that still managed to watch everything. Broad-shouldered, long-limbed, with the kind of stillness that made other men step careful. His coat was trail-dusted and worn in a way that said it had been used for work, not for show. Luke Carver. She didn't know him personally, but she'd heard the name more than once since stepping off the stage here a week ago. Folks said he ran the largest spread north of town, that he'd built it with his bare hands and defended it with his rifle more than once. They also said he'd buried his wife 6 winters back and hadn't looked at a woman the same way since. Now those unreadable eyes slid from her face to the 2 small figures beside her. There was no pity in them, just assessment. "You're the Bennett widow?" he said, his voice a low scrape against the room's hush. She hesitated. "Yes. You've got no roof, no woodpile, and no man to split it." "That right?" The directness stung, but she nodded once. "That's right." He stood, and the room seemed to tilt slightly at the shift of his height. Crossing the space in 3 long strides, he stopped a pace from her, close enough she could see the frost in his dark beard. "I've got a house that needs tending and meals that need cooking. You've got 2 mouths to feed besides your own. I'm offering a trade." Her heart thudded. What sort of trade? Marriage. The word dropped between them like a shot. Behind her, someone chuckled under his breath. Another man muttered, "That's Carver for you." Luke didn't flinch. "It's a fair bargain. You and the young uns get shelter, food, and a safe place to winter. I get someone to keep the house in order. That's all it is. I'm not promising anything else." Clara's pride told her to turn him down flat. Her reality reminded her that without work or a roof, the 3 of them wouldn't last a month in this wind. She searched his face for cruelty or trickery, but found only the cool patience of a man accustomed to getting answers. "I'll need to think on it," she said, her voice sharper than she meant. "You've got till sundown." He stepped aside, making room for her to pass. The children were quiet on the walk back to the boarding house, their boots crunching in the snow. Ruth finally asked, "Are we going to live on a ranch, Clara?" Her voice held a thread of hope. Clara didn't have the heart to snip. She didn't answer right away. The truth was, the idea of binding herself to a stranger, even one offering safety, twisted her stomach into knots. But the image of Samuel's thin frame and Ruth's chapped hands gnawed at her worse. By sundown, she'd knocked on Luke Carver's door. The house stood at the edge of his land, long and low against the rise of the hills. Smoke curled from the chimney in a stubborn ribbon. Luke answered with the same unreadable expression, as though he'd known she would come. "You agree to the terms?" "I do." The words caught in her throat. He stepped aside. "Then come in." Inside smelled of wood smoke and leather, with a faint hint of something metallic. Gun oil, she realized. The main room was clean but spare, a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a stone hearth where logs burned steady. "This is where you'll cook and keep house," he said, his tone brisk, businesslike. "Upstairs, 2 bedrooms. You and the children take the one on the left. I don't go in there. I expect meals on time, wood chopped when it's low, and the place kept in order. I don't tolerate laziness or gossip. Clear?" She lifted her chin. "Clear." His gaze flicked to the children, who stood huddled just inside the door, eyes darting everywhere. "You keep them close. This land's not without trouble." She didn't ask what kind. The first day was a trial of silence. Luke worked outside, tending to the horses and breaking ice on the water troughs, speaking only to ask if she needed supplies. Clara unpacked what little they had and set about making a meal from the salted pork and potatoes in the pantry. She found a strange kind of satisfaction in sweeping the floor, stoking the fire, bringing warmth into a house that had clearly gone too long without it. On the second morning, she made the mistake of feeding the horses before Luke came in from the barn. She thought she was helping. "Those animals get fed in a set order for a reason," he said, his voice clipped. "You do it your way. One of the Mares will founder. I was only trying to. Don't. Just don't." He turned on his heel and left, the door banging shut behind him. That night, the wind rose again, howling across the plains. Somewhere around midnight, the sound of horses outside snapped Clara awake. She sat up, straining to listen. Hoofbeats muffled voices. The floorboards creaked under Luke's boots as he crossed the door, rifle already in hand. "Stay inside," he told her without looking back. She waited, every muscle tight, listening to the murmur of voices outside and the occasional snort of a horse. Then crack! A gunshot, sharp and close. Her heart leapt to her throat. She clutched the children close, whispering for them to be quiet. The minutes dragged, the wind clawing at the walls. When Luke came back, his coat sleeve was torn, a dark stain spreading across it. His face was unreadable, but his voice was even when he said, "Go back to sleep." She didn't ask what had happened. She only watched the slow drip of blood onto the floor and thought, I married him for shelter. I didn't know it came with storms. ChatGPT said. By morning, the storm had blown itself east, leaving the world white and brittle under a thin sun. Clara rose before the children, stoked the hearth until it gave off a steady glow, and set water to boil for coffee. She'd barely gotten the pot settled on the iron grate when she heard the door open and the unmistakable sound of boots shaking off snow. Luke came in, setting his rifle against the wall, his coat hanging heavy from dampness. The torn sleeve from the night before had been roughly stitched by his own hand, she guessed, and the stain of blood was faint, but still there. "You're hurt," she said, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Ruth and Samuel. "It's nothing. It's bleeding again." She moved toward him, reaching for the sleeve before she could think better of it. He tensed but didn't pull away. The wound wasn't deep, but the skin around it was angry and red from the cold. "Sit," she told him. When he hesitated, she added, "You can glare at me all you want, but I'm not letting it fester." Something in her tone made his jaw tighten, but he sat at the table. She cleaned the wound with warm water and the bit of whiskey she found in the cupboard, catching the way his mouth twitched at the sting. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't sharp or heavy. It was simply there, like the quiet in a church. When she'd tied the bandage, he looked at her directly. "Thank you." It was the first time he'd said the words to her. They felt heavier than they should have. The day unfolded in chores. Luke worked outside, repairing a section of fence that had buckled under the snow. Clara tended to the house, mended a shirt, and salted down some pork from the smokehouse. By late afternoon, the air smelled of hickory and spice, and for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of something close to settled. That feeling didn't last. A week later, Luke told her he was riding into town for supplies. Clara offered to go, half out of wanting a change from the four walls, half from the quiet restlessness she couldn't shake. He hesitated but agreed, warning her not to linger. The ride into town was brisk, the sky the color of pewter, the snow along the road packed into uneven ridges. She hitched the mare outside the general store, tucked her shawl tighter, and stepped inside. The usual warmth of the stove greeted her, along with the same cluster of men leaning and watching. She kept her eyes down, traded for flour and coffee, and was just tying off her sack when a voice beside her said, "You're Carver's new wife." She turned. The man was tall and narrow, with a face carved in sharp planes and a mouth that never seemed to close all the way. His eyes were pale, almost colorless. "Yes," she said, her tone flat. He leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of chew. "Tell Carver his land won't be his much longer." Her fingers tightened on the sack's cord. "I don't know what you mean." "You don't have to. Just carry the message." He stepped back, tipping his hat in mock politeness before turning toward the door. On the ride home, the wind seemed sharper, the silence of the snow heavier. She didn't tell Luke about the man, not yet, but she watched him more closely over the next days, the way his eyes swept the horizon whenever he stepped outside, the rifle that never strayed far from his reach. Life on the ranch was a grind of cold mornings and long days, but slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to move around each other with less friction. One morning, she came into the kitchen to find a cup of coffee waiting for her at the table, steam curling from it. She looked at him in surprise. "Thought you might need it," he said, already turning back to the stove. Another evening, when she came in from feeding the chickens with snow caked to her skirts, he took the bucket from her hands without a word and set it aside. These were small things, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Clara they felt like cracks in a wall she hadn't realized she was chipping at. The thaw didn't reach his words much, though. He was still a man of few sentences, and when he did speak, it was in the same measured tone. But the sharp edge had dulled. The trouble came back on a night when the wind was rising again, carrying with it the smell of snow. Clara was setting a pot of stew on the table when the dogs outside broke into furious barking. Luke was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from its stand. "Stay with the children," he told her. She could hear voices through the wall, low, urgent, and then the scuff of boots in the snow. A shout. A gunshot cracked the night wide open. She flinched, pulling Ruth and Samuel close. The sound of running footsteps pounded toward the barn. Something inside her snapped. The thought of strangers near the animals, the supplies, the very heart of the place. She reached for the shotgun Luke kept propped in the corner, the weight of it heavy but steady in her hands. She slipped out the side door, keeping to the shadow of the house. The barn loomed ahead, its doors half open, a lantern swinging wildly inside. A man was bent over one of the stalls, fumbling with a bridle. "Put it down," she said, her voice carrying more steel than she felt. He turned, surprise flashing across his face. She didn't give him time to speak. She cocked the shotgun, the sound loud in the narrow space. "Now!" The bridle clattered to the floor. Behind her, Luke's voice cut through the air. "Out!" The man stiffened but obeyed, stepping into the yard with his hands up. Two more riders were already retreating into the dark, snow kicking up under their horses' hooves. Luke's rifle was steady in his hands, but his eyes flicked to her. And in that moment something shifted. Later, when the barn was secured and the door barred, Luke came to her where she stood by the hearth, still gripping the shotgun though her hands ached from it. "You've handled one before," he said, not a question. "My pa kept one. Said a body ought to know how to protect themselves." A shadow of a smile touched his mouth before it was gone. "You did good." The words warmed her in a way the fire couldn't. That night, after the children were asleep, she lay awake listening to the wind. The danger was real now, no longer just a shadow on Luke's face or a whisper in town. And with that danger came an unspoken truth. They were bound together by more than a paper promise. Somewhere in the dark, she thought she heard him shift in his chair by the hearth, the slow scrape of wood in the firebox. She pictured him there awake and watchful, and for the first time since stepping off the stage into Blackthorn's bitter wind, she felt something that might have been safety. But safety, she knew, was never more than one bullet away from being gone. Dawn came slow and sullen, bleeding pale light over the snow-capped hills. Clara rose before the frost could settle on the inside of the windows, pulling on her boots in the half-dark. The smell of last night's smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the barn fire they'd stamped out together just hours earlier. The men hadn't been back since the attempt on the horses, but the air carried the taut quiet of something unfinished. Luke was already outside, his breath fogging in the sharp morning air as he checked the fence line. She watched him from the doorway, the sure way he moved, shoulders squared, rifle slung loose in his hand but never far from ready. The bruises on his knuckles from the fight 2 nights back were still dark. When he came in, he shook the snow from his coat and set the rifle by the wall. "They'll come again," he said without preamble. She poured coffee into his cup. "How do you know?" He met her eyes, steady and unblinking. "Because men like that don't stop until they get what they came for, or until they're stopped." There was a heaviness in the words that told her he wasn't talking about cattle thieves alone. Over the next 2 days, they prepared without speaking much about it. Luke mended the gate to the corral and moved the livestock closer to the house. Clara took inventory of the pantry, setting aside what could be carried quickly if they had to flee, though she prayed it wouldn't come to that. She cleaned and loaded the shotgun, the weight of it familiar now. On the 3rd evening, the sky turned the color of lead, the air thick with the smell of an oncoming storm. The wind rattled the eaves in short bursts as though warning them. Ruth and Samuel were already asleep upstairs when Luke stepped inside from a porch. "They're out there," he said. She felt the air shift. "How many?" "Enough to try us." He moved to the table, unrolling a small map of the property. "You take the hayloft. Good vantage point, good cover. If anyone makes it past me, you put M down." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You're sure you want me shooting?" He gave her a look, firm but not unkind. "I'm sure I trust you." The words struck deeper than she expected. They took their positions as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Luke crouched near the hitching post, rifle steady, eyes on the tree line. Clara settled into the hayloft, the smell of dry grass and old leather in her nose, the shotgun balanced across her knees. Her heart beat slow and heavy, every sense sharpened. The riders came out of the dark like shadows on the move, 3, then 5, then more, their horses' breath steaming in the cold. The leader was the man from town, pale-eyed and sharp-faced, a grin splitting his mouth as he raised his hand to signal the others. Luke's rifle cracked once, the sound shattering the stillness. One man tumbled from his saddle, the horse veering away. The others spurred forward. Gunfire erupted, short, vicious bursts that lit the dark with flashes. Clara fired from the loft, the recoil biting her shoulder. A rider swerved hard, nearly unseated, before wheeling his horse back toward the gate. Snow churned under hooves, shouts tangled with the screams of the wind. A bullet splintered the loft's railing inches from Clara's hand. She ducked, then rose again, sighting down the barrel, squeezing the trigger. The pale-eyed leader spun in the saddle as buckshot tore through his arm. He clutched it, swearing, and jerked his horse toward the open field. Luke moved through the yard like a man born to battle, each shot deliberate, each step purposeful. Clara saw him drop one man who'd tried to flank the barn, then another who had nearly reached the porch. The fight broke as suddenly as it began. The survivors wheeled away into the darkness, their shouts fading under the howl of the wind. For a moment, only the hiss of falling snow and the pounding of her own blood filled Clara's ears. She climbed down from aloft, her knees unsteady. Luke stood in the yard, breath heaving, the rifle hanging loose in his hand. A streak of blood ran from his temple, more from a graze than a wound, but enough to make her chest tighten. "You're hit," she said, moving toward him. "Not bad." He wiped it away with the back of his hand, eyes scanning the tree line one last time before turning to her. "You shoot well." Her mouth quirked despite the exhaustion. "You sound surprised." "I'm not." They worked side by side to check the perimeter, driving off one injured horse that had wandered back, tending to the livestock. By the time they stepped into the house, the fire in the hearth was low, and the children stirred faintly upstairs, unaware of the danger that had passed so close. Luke poured them each a cup of coffee, the steam curling between them. "I lost someone once," he said, finally, his voice low. "My wife. Raiders hit while I was out with the herd. Came back to a house I didn't recognize. Walls were still standing, but everything in me was gone." Clara didn't speak, sensing he hadn't finished. "Since then, I've kept those walls high. Kept people out. Safer that way." His eyes met hers, shadowed but unflinching. "But tonight, watching you up there, watching you fight for this place like it was your own, I realized maybe I'd been keeping the wrong things out." Her throat felt tight. "I married you for shelter, Luke. I never meant to." She stopped, searching for the right words. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being just that. He nodded slowly, as though the truth of it had been waiting between them for weeks. "This is your home now, Clara. Not because of a bargain. Because you've earned it. Because you're part of it." The wind outside rattled against the windows, but it no longer sounded like a threat. She thought of the night she'd walked into the general store with nothing but 2 frightened children and a handful of coins, and the man who'd offered her a roof with no promise of warmth. Now, the warmth was here, in the steady set of his shoulders, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, in the quiet safety of the house they shared. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Then I'll stay." He covered her hand with his own, calloused and warm. "Good. Because I can't picture this place without you." Later, after the fire was banked and the lamps turned low, Clara stood at the window, watching snow drift over the yard, covering the churned tracks of the night's fight. Luke was upstairs, checking on Ruth and Samuel, his voice a low murmur that carried a note she hadn't heard before, something gentle, almost content. The frontier would never be safe. Tomorrow might bring more trouble, more men who wanted to take what wasn't theirs. But tonight, she knew they would face it together. And in a land that measured worth by what a person could hold on to, she realized she'd given Luke something he hadn't even known he'd lost. Not just the fire in his hearth, but the one in his soul. The wind had a different bite that morning, sharp and hollow, the kind that carried sound for miles and made a body feel exposed. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under her boots, and pulled her shawl tighter. Luke was already saddling his horse, the cold painting his breath in white bursts. "They're not finished," he said without looking up. His voice was calm, but she heard the steel in it. She'd known it too. The last attack had been too sloppy for men like that to accept as their final play. And if Luke was right, and he usually was, they'd come harder next time. Inside, she checked the rifle again, running her fingers along the oiled stock. Ruth and Samuel watched from the kitchen table, quiet as mice. Clara crouched down, so her eyes met theirs. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear. You understand." 2 nods. No questions. The children had learned quickly that the frontier rewarded silence and watchfulness. By midday, the sky had lowered, heavy with the promise of snow. Luke moved with restless precision, checking the barn doors, laying extra cartridges where he could reach them fast. Clara matched his energy without speaking, carrying wood to the porch, filling buckets from the pump. There was a rhythm to the preparation, one they both seemed to know without having to put it into words. It was late afternoon when the first sign came, a single crow cutting across the pale sky, cawing sharply. Then another sound, fainter but unmistakable, hooves on packed snow. Luke's head came up. "They're here." The riders appeared like a tide breaking from the tree line. 8 this time, their silhouettes jagged against the white world. At their head was the pale-eyed man, arm-bound in a makeshift sling, but riding tall, his mouth curled in a sneer. Luke turned to Clara. "Same as before. Loft?" She climbed without hesitation, her boots soundless on the ladder. The hayloft smelled of dust and animals, warm enough to melt the edge off the cold. She settled into position, the shotgun braced against the wooden beam, her eyes tracking movement below. The men spread out in a half-circle, hemming in the yard. The pale-eyed man called out, voice carrying over the snow. "Carver, you can hand it over now, land, stock, and all, or we'll take it after you're dead. Won't make a difference to me." Luke stepped forward, rifle in hand, every line of him steady. "You came a long way to die in my yard." The man's laugh was short and ugly. "Last time you had a woman watching your back. Let's see if she can save you twice." Luke didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle and fired. The yard exploded into chaos, gunfire snapping, horses rearing, snow flying in clouds under pounding hooves. Clara's first shot dropped a rider trying to flank the barn. The second sent another scrambling for cover behind the woodpile. Luke moved like a shadow between fence posts, firing with ruthless precision. Two of the men broke off, heading for the house. Clara tracked them, waited until they were close enough to see the frost on their coats, then fired. One went down, the other veered away, clutching aside. The pale-eyed man pressed forward, using his men as cover, firing in quick bursts toward Luke's position. Clara shifted her aim, lining him up in the sight, but before she could squeeze the trigger, a shot splintered the beam above her head. She ducked, heart hammering, then rose again to find him gone from her line of fire. Below, Luke rolled from cover just as another rider charged. He fired point-blank, the man tumbling into the snow with a grunt. The pale-eyed man used the moment to slip toward the barn. Clara's blood went cold. If he got inside, he could take the high ground or set fire to the supplies. She scrambled down the ladder, landing hard, and slipped into the shadows along the barn wall. The pale-eyed man was there, pistol drawn, breath coming fast. His eyes lit with recognition when he saw her. I warned you to carry a message." "You should have taken your own warning," she said, raising the shotgun. He moved faster than she expected, lunging forward and grabbing the barrel. The struggle was raw and close, their boots sliding in the packed snow. He wrenched the gun aside and slammed her against the wall hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. "Luke," she shouted, but the man clamped a hand over her mouth. Somewhere outside, rifle fire cracked again, shouts echoing, but here it was just the two of them, the smell of sweat and gun oil sharp in the cold air. Clara twisted, stomping hard on his instep. He hissed, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. She swung the stock of the shotgun into his jaw. The crack was satisfying, but he came back at her, fist swinging. Then the shot came, loud in the enclosed space. The pale-eyed man froze, eyes wide, and staggered forward before collapsing at her feet. Behind him stood Luke, rifle still raised, his breath ragged. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her chest was still heaving. They stepped outside together. The yard was littered with the aftermath. Two men down, others fleeing into the trees, their tracks messy in the churned snow. The wind had picked up again, blowing hard enough to sting their faces. Luke scanned the horizon, then lowered his rifle. "That's the last of them. For now." They dragged the bodies to the edge of the property, left them there for whatever burying the land would do. By the time they came back inside, the lamps were lit, and Ruth and Samuel had crept halfway down the stairs, eyes wide. "It's over," Clara told them, her voice steady. After the children had gone back to bed, Luke poured 2 whiskeys and set one in front of her. "You fought like hell," he said. "I had reason to." He studied her for a long moment, the lamplight catching in his eyes. "I told you I built walls to keep people out. You tore them down without even trying. And I'm glad you did." She felt the truth of it settle between them, warm as the fire. "You've given me a place to stand, Luke. That's more than most ever had out here." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "It's not just a place. It's yours as much as mine." Outside, the wind roared over the hills, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine. Inside, the fire snapped and popped, its light spilling over the walls that no longer felt like barriers. Clara thought of the first night she'd walked into this house, a stranger bound by a bargain. Now, the bargain was nothing. The bond was everything,